Hello, welcome to our Alumni Ask Me Anything series as part of our 90th anniversary celebration of the School of Information and Library Science. My name is Lori Haight, and I serve as the Career Services Coordinator, and today we have Dr. Meredith Evans joining us. We have collected some questions, but I wanted to let the audience know we can also take in additional questions if time allows. So if you'd like to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Thank you for joining us. So here's a question to get us started. What was your path to learning about and then wanting to work with archives?
Oh, that's pretty easy. I was a history student in undergrad. And so I actually worked with a program with Duke to do oral histories and dive into the archives, and then did a summer fellowship at University of Florida, where we also worked in the archives. So I was introduced to it through my degree and my bachelor's degree and knew it was something I wanted to do. But I was on the track for a PhD in history to teach. And that got derailed a little bit with life. And somebody said, go to library school and do archives. And I was like, oh, I could do that. And so I went and got my library degree. Yeah.
Great. You've been very involved in professional development associations. How did you begin your involvement with them?
Well, that's also a good question. So I was always active in something. I'm in a sorority. I was a member of the NAACP. So I knew about nonprofits and meeting different people and their professions. They had professional associations. So, if you got your master's, your MBA, there's, business schools have professional associations, law schools have associations. And so I knew of them, and I knew that libraries, well, after I got into the profession more and got my library degree, I knew that libraries have professions too, professional associations. And I found that going to a few meetings, even as a student, or going to my friends' meetings as adults, that there was networking and connections there that you can't just make in school, or you can't just make living life. You kind of have to be in an environment where you can meet other people who do what you do and think like you think. And so I really value professional associations, and started participating as a volunteer in different groups. I was on the educators group at one point. I was on the diversity group at other points. I'm still active in ALA and active in SAA as well, just to keep good friendships and good networks. And that's why I stay.
Thank you. When you started your term as the Society of American Archivists president, you spoke about the importance of diversifying the record. How can archivists work toward that goal?
Yeah, so I think whenever you work in an archive, you should always do some kind of collection analysis. And that takes a lot of work. You got to read through all the finding aids. You got to read through all the inventories that aren't of materials that aren't available to the public, and looking to see where there are gaps. Oftentimes there are gaps in the collection based on race, ethnicity, gender, but there's also sometimes their collections are there, they're just not processed, or they're not described in a way that people can find them. So I feel like you do a collection analysis. Sometimes you can use a tool to do that, and sometimes you just have to do the old-fashioned work of looking through the collections, or bringing in a bunch of researchers or people, students or whoever, to come in and kind of look at things together and kind of jot down those gaps. And then once you see what the gaps are, it could be time period, it could be, again, gender, race, ethnicity, it could be location. There's lots of different ways to fill in gaps, but that's when you start. And that's when you think about what kind of collections will fill these needs, where can I get those collections? Sometimes people buy collections. I'm kind of old school. I feel like you should just ask for them until they give it to you. But I think you have to start by really looking to see what you have, and then saying, okay, there's interest in these categories that we don't have. Or we get a lot of research, and researchers that come in and look at things from the 1920s, or look at the university or the organization I work for, and then you want to make sure they get an accurate picture of what that was like. And so when you go through those things and you see what's missing, then you go find it, which is easier said than done, but it's possible. And then you can also get into the community. I think wherever your facility is located, or whatever the constituency is, I think that's also where you start. You ask questions and you find out if people are still living and what organizations feed it into other organizations. And then you ask and you consistently ask and you develop relationships until you're able to get materials to supplement.
Thank you. What are some ways that archivists can also work toward the goal of diversifying who are the practitioners in the field?
You know, recruiting is everything. And I think participating in professional associations helps. But I also feel like just having relationships with other institutions that are like you also helps. And you will find that there are people there that may be interested in the profession or may not be, but you have to start a conversation. And then the other thing is, you know, start young. You know, go visit middle schools, go visit high schools, and tell them what you do and why you do it. I think we often do college things. You know, you're always when the history majors have their fair for what they can do with their degrees, they invite a librarian or an archivist there because they know if you have a humanities degree, you can ultimately get a job in our profession. But I feel like it starts young. I mean, I broadcast all the time that I'm an archivist. And, you know, for little kids, I tell them I read dead people's mail and they love that, particularly the boys. You know, as I get older, we talk about managing people and how that record is reflected in the press, right? Like a news story or a 30-second television news story. Somebody wrote a 500-page book about, and then somebody else wrote a 500-page book arguing against that first book. And so showing them where those resources came from, right? As they get older, because they're starting to do research papers anyway. And that, I think that's a start. And then you tell them what you do. And then you know, now we're in social media world, right? So you can also talk about collection building and use a lot of Instagram posts or Twitter feeds to show how people have chronicled art or chronicled newsworthy stories or chronicled their life and what that looks like. And that's similar to a photo album or a diary that you kept in writing, you know, back in the day. So I think you can show people real life examples and then tell them why you do what you do and how you do it, whether it's in print or with books or with digital content.
Great. Do you coordinate or work with directors of other presidential libraries?
All the time. All the time. We actually have a biweekly meeting. We try to collaborate on exhibits. Pre-pandemic, we were trying to actually all have the same traveling exhibit. And we did one about civil rights. It was an artist, and that artist temporary exhibit did go to about 4 different presidential libraries. So we all do reporting together because that's what it is. So we all have a relationship. Each presidential library is different because some have foundations and some don't. I don't. The Carter Center is an NGO and we share property, but it's not my actual foundation. Whereas other facilities have the Bush Foundation, the Reagan Foundation, FDR has an institute and a foundation. And so it tends to be different how we all function. Sometimes your foundation's super engaged and sometimes they're not. Sometimes the foundation takes on the education component of it or supports digitization, and sometimes they don't. And so it just varies across the board. The mission's always the same, but the programming, you have to kind of be certain of what program you're watching and who's sponsoring that. Because what the programming that a library does is often different from the foundation or labeled differently. That makes sense. So.
Thank you. Someone else, just to go along with your current role, what excites you the most about your current role?
That we still are working. We still have jobs. You know, I think what's exciting about this job is that I still have a living president who's still very engaged. He's, you know, President Carter reads everything, which is pretty awesome. So if you shoot him an email, yes, he does have an email, or you go through his assistants and, you know, you ask a question, he's going to get back to you. He's probably going to ask you more questions in his answer. So that's fun. It's really nice to have. Mrs. Carter is probably in my top 5 best first ladies ever. She's sort of the political machine behind the machine that's very quietly known. So it's great. And then part of this job was also helping them see how valuable they are to society personally and professionally. So we are the official federal record of his administration, but we also wanted to make sure that his family life and his personal life were documented, along with supporting the Carter Center in their record keeping processes, so that at some point there'd be a unified look at his career, which he himself thinks is kind of crazy how long he's lasted. He really had only prepared to be like 82, and he's still here, and he's still writing books and writing op-eds and things like that. So we do have a small family collection, home videos and photographs. We also have some papers. We have some of Mrs. Carter's papers, which she just gifted officially pre-pandemic. And it was fun to do a deed of gift with her because she felt like she was part of his deed of gift, which actually said at one time, President Carter and family and authorized users was a part of it. And I said, you deserve your own deed of gift. You have three, Mrs. Carter has 3 books herself, and she has her own set of papers. She took notes in a lot of meetings when they were in office, when he was in office. And so she deserved her own, and she finally signed it. And she had all these restrictions at first, and restricted 20, 30 years after I die. And I thought, you're 93, no. So it was a 2-year ordeal to kind of convince her that this was what she should do, and that we would make sure that her reputation and everything was protected as best we could. But it's just a joy to work with them. And then it's also really great to work with David Ferriero. I had met David when he was at Duke. And so it's kind of full circle to kind of work with him, even though he lives in another state. None of my bosses live near me, which is the best thing about this job. No one can come to your office and knock on your door. So that's been really a real joy. And I would say having a museum is a real joy. Having been in academia a long time with exhibit space and gallery space, now I have an opportunity to work with lifelong learners at a different level, and K through 12, which, in academia, you don't always work with K through 12. You know people with kids K through 12, but you don't really reshape what archives looks for that age group until you have a museum, and you're going, I guess we should kind of explain a little bit more what that means to people for this 4th grader. So it's fun.
Great. A question came in about growing the diversity of collections. Do you find it appropriate or equitable to pay for collections from marginalized individuals, groups who would greatly benefit from the financial support?
Sure. I mean, if you're going to spend $200,000 on a literary collection, then why wouldn't you spend $200,000 on a community's collection? I think that you just have to have a process, and you have to be equitable with your process. And I think you have to be careful that you're not insulting somebody as well. So, don't give a community $5,000 after you've given, what you consider a well-known, or full faculty members collection, and you give them $200,000. You really have to be clear on what you're buying and why, and how much you're willing to spend and why, and be willing to negotiate. I will take it a step further. I'm less concerned about spending money on collections as I am with helping people really think through the rights to those collections. As archivists, we tend to take things and keep things. And sometimes we get them processed and available. And sometimes it's 20, 30 years before we get something processed and available. And so don't mislead your donor. Don't expect your donor to always pay for stuff. So you have to kind of have a lot of matrix in your own shop to do your job well. If you know this person is well off and wants to donate their collection and can afford to contribute to an endowment or pay for a person to help process it so it's accessible sooner than later or something like that, that's great, that's fine. If the community archives and archivist wants that same treatment and they may or may not have money, then you have to think that through. Is it about the money, or is it about the value of the content? Or, and if one collection that comes with money is not something that quite fits in the collection, but everybody wants the money, or is an area that really is robust and people use a lot, you have to contemplate those things. The community archive, is this something that you want to do on behalf of that group? Do they want you to do it? Is it materials that are going to be used immediately? These are things you have to think about before you make decisions. And I think the equity comes with you having a matrix and knowing what that collection development plan looks like for your shop. And that's a tough, the collection development policy always is tough. People make it too broad. Just because you make one, how do you put it into action? And that's where the matrix comes in. That's when you have to kind of think through how you want to do this moving forward. And then what's the impact of it if you were to leave that repository, right? And so I think about rights issues a lot. I've taken in a couple of community collections over the years where I've allowed that group to maintain the rights to it. And then we have a set way to do photographs or copies of things. And then they have to, we used to come back and readdress it every couple of years, because if that person leaves and then all of a sudden the secretary of the community place or whoever the person takes over is getting phone calls about photographs and rights to photographs, that becomes really laborious. So you really have to think through what that means and make sure that people are on board with it. And then moving forward for the longevity, that the next person who comes in your position or their position is willing to continue that relationship. So it's a lot of work and it's something to monitor, but I definitely think it can be equitable. And I feel like if you're going to spend money on something, that's a great area to spend money on. As long as your commitment is very clear and the use of it is going to be very clear and honest.
Great. Can you reflect on your time at Washington University in St. Louis during the Ferguson uprising, particularly now that you're several years out from it? What lessons did you learn, or what did you wish you knew then that you know now?
One lesson I would have learned, it's interesting because that was a really fantastic time. Challenging and fantastic at the same time. We had the support of the Dean of Libraries at the time, Jeffrey Treziak, to do that project when I started. And the first group, the committee for it, was made up of faculty members, librarians, and archivists and students. And so it was a very emotional moment, but it was also an amazing moment. The point of creating that Omeka instance for documenting Ferguson was to allow people to just upload materials in real time. That was kind of sort of the impetus behind it, is how do you collect this new medium, well, it wasn't really new anymore, but this new social media in real time and reflect what was going on that was different from the media. And the challenge with that was legal was stressed about it completely. So I will say WashU's legal did not like this Omeka instance, but we only kept the email address of people who uploaded materials, and if they were the people who wrote the description for it as well. So what I would do differently would be to have a curator of the repository also working with that material as it was being uploaded, because there's no file structure. And because the metadata and descriptions done by the person who uploaded, it could be a lot or it could be nothing. Mm. And that's the challenge. The only reason why we kept the email is if we saw something that was sort of questionable, we would email the person and say, what is this? So one time there was an image of a child with a sign uploaded, and we emailed and said, is this your child? We tried to get more information because we didn't want to be unethical and we didn't want to put somebody at risk. So I think having a curator at the time of the repository would have been super, super useful, just to kind of have our own run of time stamping and kind of our own description on the side that we could probably put in the background for people to search, because it's very difficult to search that repository. I would also separately put in, we have a lot of videographers and photographers that uploaded things, but uploaded it with their image, their business tags on it and watermarks on it. And so I might have put them if we had a curator, we probably could have put that in a separate category. Mm-hmm. And then people uploaded things afterwards, zines, and then people uploaded court papers, the court documents. So it would be nice to have it curated mm-hmm. in a way that it's easily accessible. But it was, I wouldn't have changed what we did at the time, because we came up with something really quick and it was effective. We even tried to solicit things from opposite viewpoints. We were not very successful with that, but we did try. And then the other thing about it is because it was such an open source, we were not prepared for police surveillance, and the county police and the St. Louis police used our database to do facial recognition, identify people who, some people did get arrested and some people did get questioned based on these images. And so that was unexpected, and no way for us to really control it. By the time we caught on, we could have removed those items, but at that point, they had, things had already started. So there were a few things I would do differently, but mainly about how the project was structured, and then moving forward, once everything settled or the year anniversary came, still having at least a curator at that point to really dive in, to kind of make it more accessible to the people who want to use it. There's cool things in that repository. I think we're the only ones that has the picture of the Buddhists protesting. That's the only picture, and they uploaded that, and we have no way to contact them. And that's where that picture comes from. And I see it in the news, and I see it, and I'm like, oh, that's the only picture. We're the only ones with that at the time.
Wow.
So there's really cool things about that repository. And it also built relationships. Us going to Ferguson, we did reach out. We had students go, people who were already protesting from the university were still taking pictures and uploading things. But we also developed a relationship with the Ferguson Historical Society. We worked with the museums in the city as people were all trying to figure out a way to document this and honor it, and also ensure that the people were not being misused or anything like that. So it's a fantastic project.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. We're going to pivot a little bit because we have a bunch of questions coming in kind of about students who are at SILS wanting to be starting in the archives profession. So one question is, what is one thing you wish you had been exposed to while a student?
Things I was exposed to as a student?
Or things
in archives?
You wish you had been exposed to?
Oh, I get that question a lot. I think, it's funny because library and information in schools, this is the main struggle, right? You can either be a specialist in something, something really, that's your focus, or you can touch a little bit of everything and be well-bred with it. Either way, you're going to end up learning stuff on the job. That's just, 20 years ago, I might say something different because things weren't as quick moving as they are now. But now even I have to go back and, 3 years in, I'm thinking, okay, I got to relearn Instagram, or I got to relearn Twitter, or I really hate Snapchat. So I really don't want to ever do Snapchat again. I won't do TikTok, but I still know it. So there's so many moving parts that the days of just trying to figure out how to dub an audio tape are gone, that you kind of have to at least know a little bit about everything, then decide what you want to do and then focus on that. But I would finish the degree and then go back and get more information and more knowledge about what you want to really study. So my takeaway from library school was I got a breadth of everything. I got my master's degree from Clark Atlanta before they closed the library school. And I loved that degree, partly because we did a lot of what would now be considered old school stuff. We were doing bibliographies and what we used to call pathfinders, which people now call subject guides, which people now call something else, lit guides, it's all the same thing. But we did that, and we were introduced to, I wish I could remember the software program, but it was basically it was reference on the computer, but it was really sort of like a business library style and how to search and what kind of search terms. We did that really early. So when I got to Chapel Hill right after, my first exposure to Chapel Hill was digitization, and I worked with Jill Sexton and documenting the South project. And so I used my library degree I already had about subject guides and learning how to research and identify sources. And I used that to learn about digitization and applied some of that to that project. So it all worked, but that's still me working, not actually sitting in a class, taking information, right? So I think that what you have to take away from library school is, here's the skill set we're trying to teach you. Here's an example of it. We want you to try to do it and master it, and then you specialize. I would have loved to take more classes in databases, but I just wasn't good at it. So I can manipulate a spreadsheet all day, because that's what archivists, that's what we use. We still are good with some Excel spreadsheets. But when it comes to like Access and MySQL, I'm lost. To this day, I'm lost. So you just have to kind of pick your battles and know what you're good at, and then get the degree and then study some more in other areas. Because what makes library science to me different from information science or computer science or communications even, is that we really focus on the art of the work and the person. And those are the skills that you also learn on the job. But you want to know, when you're in your classes, you want to know enough to serve that community that you want to serve. So it's a catch-22. I wish I could say something better, but
no, that's good. We always talk about that T approach, the breadth and then the depth. And so your suggestion to get the breadth first, I think, is very helpful.
Yeah, especially if you don't know what you want to do, right? Like if you're not sure what part of librarianship you want to get into, the world's so big now. There's so many cool things you can do. Yeah,
exactly. I think we're down to our last question. One came in that they were wondering how the work of the Carter Library affects the record-keeping practices of organizations that President Carter has been involved in, for instance, Habitat for Humanity. Do you know if their record-keeping practices have changed so that they can contribute relevant materials to the Carter Library?
What was the last part of it again? Repeat that.
Do you know if their record-keeping practices have changed so that they can contribute relevant materials to the Carter Library?
I don't know. I'm not sure okay, so let me answer it in two different ways. We're federal, and we have the National Archive. We're administered by the National Archives. So there's processes that we follow for the National Archives, regardless of what the collection is. So just to kind of help people understand, there is no national archivist, there's no archivist from the National Archives or records manager for the National Archives in the White House. So every president is responsible, and their staff are responsible for their own records management.
Oh.
We may give them a little overview. We may give them advice. We may say, this is how you should do it. We might make recommendations, but the National Archives have no control over what happens in the White House. This is very common in state offices as well. You want the mayor's papers. They give you what they want to give you, and nobody's coming behind them going, you didn't give us this. You won't know until you get everything, until you've really gone through it. And it takes years to go through anybody's collection. So with that said, President Carter is a Depression baby, and he was in office in the late 70s, early 80s, where memos were still real, right? We weren't doing email yet. We weren't doing electronic stuff yet. So President Carter is meticulous. You send memos. To this day, send him memos. He reads the memo. God forbid you have a spelling error, he corrects your spelling, and he writes notes back on your memo and gives it back to you.
Wow.
They keep a copy, but he gives it back to you. He does it with cards. I sent President Carter a thank you card when I started the job. He sent the card back to me with a note on it. I was so offended. I was like, oh my God, I sent it to the wrong place. But it turns out I flipped it over. He literally wrote a note, oh, we're so happy you're here, on the card I sent. So this is how he works. So his collection, that's personal and professional, is very similar to that. And then we have collections from different departments of his administration, and they're pretty consistent. So there's written memos, there's multiple reports, because this is in the day where we weren't sharing it via email. So there'll be 15 of the same report. If it's got her writing on it, that's the one we keep. There's things that we do. Now, with his personal and family papers, again, he's very meticulous. He gifts things each year for the museum because he wants it appraised. He's the last kind of deeded president. After that, the law changed. All he had to do is build the building, and then he gifts his collection along the way. So I'm in a really special position with him, but he is meticulous. He has his own set of file cabinets in Plains, Georgia. Each one of his secretaries at some point had a file structure that he maintains. Yes, there's stuff under the bed, but his files are clean. Like, he has op-eds. He has separated them per paper that he wants to send it to. He's got new book ideas, and he's just very meticulous like that. Mrs. Carter is somewhat similar. She writes on things, and she has folders, like a folder, but she also has a researcher that she's had for 10 years that kind of manages her files for her. So, and when I started, the National Archives was moving much more towards traditional archival standards and away from records management styles for presidential libraries. And the first director of the Presidential Library of Carter was from the record centers. And so we have an alphabetical filing system for constituency mail. We have, as you go through departments, it's much more manuscript-like because new people came with an archival perspective, and NARA had shifted from record center to manuscripts. So you will see a just direct split in our collection of how it's done. But you will be able to find stuff by year or in constituency mail and certain things alphabetically. So it's really a kind of hard question to answer because unlike a record center will continuously get stuff from IRS or the VA. They're on a schedule. And they will actually delete things, after a certain period of time, those things will be moved on. We're now a historic institution. We're probably not throwing out much of nothing. I did weed a couple of collections again. We found like 100 Bibles that people had sent him during his presidential campaign. And we have a bunch of kind of strange art and things like that. And some things we kept and then some things we didn't. But we didn't apply a records management schedule to it. We applied manuscript curation.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Evans, this has been a fascinating conversation, both with the role you currently have, but then also your approach to the archival space. So I want to thank you for being one of our alumni AMAs this year. And thank you very much for your time today. I really enjoyed it.
It's been a lot of fun. You know where I am if you need me.
We appreciate that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.